Hi, I'm Mike Duggan. I've been teaching restorative dentistry for over 32 years now and to over 6,000 dentists. This video shows how I do it. Real-time, mannequin-based, hands-on, point of view, and patient real. If you are a pre-dental student, an aspiring teacher, an international dentist, join me at Duggan Oral Design, dugganoraldesign.com. How do you feel?
Disappointed.
Disappointed? Okay, that's a good place to start. There's nobody that's ever taken this course that's not disappointed on the first day. As long as you're not disappointed in me, we're okay. Yeah, we're asking a really, really high standard of you that's way higher than you've ever been exposed to before. Chances are that, wherever you've been before, they're checking your preps, and dental schools are like this. You get a faculty member that looks at what you've done and says, that's okay. That's your feedback. That's okay. That's all right. That's good enough. And then they sign the form, and then you go on to the next step or whatever, you fill it or whatever, but they don't really tell you that there's some compromises built in there that are going to affect the patient. And so I'm trying to open your eyes to all the ways in which you can really look at a prep and determine, okay, is that really going to serve the patient well or not? And again, to do good dentistry, you don't have to do great dentistry. It just has to be good. It has to be dentistry that will allow the restoration to last its expected lifetime, which doesn't have to be fabulous. It doesn't have to be the most highly skilled. It doesn't have to be like, a work of art. It just has to do the job. But you have to know what the job is. You have to know every detail about what that job is. And if you do, and you check very specifically for those details, it might meet all the details and be ugly, but meet all the requirements, meet all the criteria, and be a perfectly fine preparation, allowing you to do a perfectly fine restoration. And that's all that we're really asking for. Okay, so awareness of what it is that makes it work is huge. So that's why we spent so much time yesterday talking about, why do we do a class 2 preparation the way that we do? Okay, what makes it work? So there are various aspects of that, of course. We have to be removing the decay. We have to be designing a preparation that'll maintain and hold the restorative material in a way that's going to last a long time. We don't want it falling out. We don't want it breaking. And of course, we have to make sure that the tooth structure itself is solid and stable and not breaking and, this kind of thing. So there are a lot of things to pay attention to at the same time in order to do work that's good. The skills required to then execute that preparation takes some time. You haven't necessarily been challenged at that skill level for a long time. Maybe a long time before you picked up a handpiece. And so that comes back fast. I've had a lot of people in the course that haven't picked up a handpiece for 10 or 20 years. And that takes a little bit of getting back into the flow of things, but eventually it always works. So, and of course, we need to make sure that you have a clear sense of what this little three-dimensional thing is that we're working with. Visualizing things in 3 dimensions is critical to your success. Again, we work in a microscopic 3-dimensional sculptural world, and the more we get used to living there and enjoy being there, the better we're going to do. The more likely we are to be able to do a preparation that really does the job, serves the patient well. Okay, so you should not feel depressed You might feel, what word did you use? Disappointed. You might feel disappointed, but you don't have to be depressed because we're moving forward. If you're moving backwards, that would be a big problem. But everybody's going to be moving forward, and everybody always does. But it's a painful step after step after step, and then as you start moving a little bit more smoothly, those steps come a little bit faster, and then all of a sudden you realize, okay, now we're rolling along just fine. But again, there's a whole bunch of different, mental constructs that we have to internalize, we have to embody, we have to integrate within ourselves. So, one of them is, okay, when we're doing a prep, we break up the procedure for doing the prep into steps. Obviously, we have to do that. We have to do things in the steps. We can't do everything, bang, it's done, right? It's got to be stepwise. So we decide what steps we're going to do. We decide, what makes the most sense, and then we make sure that when we've decided that we're going to do this step, that we finish it. That we finish it completely, that we evaluate it, we look at it, we say, okay, this step was done well, and then you do the next step. So again, I said that yesterday, but it's worth repeating. If you do one step poorly and then you go on to the next step, you do one step incompletely and you move on to the next step, how easy do you expect the next step to be? It's going to be really, really hard, if not impossible. If you do a step well and completely, so that it makes the next step easier, then when you get to the next step, it's a no-brainer. So when you're doing a Class 2 prep, there's a series of different steps. If you do each step completely and well before you move on to the next step, take a little time to do each step well. Make sure you've got it done well before you move on to the next step, and you'll actually work faster. Isn't that bizarre? You slow down, and you get the job done faster. That doesn't seem to make much sense, does it? But if you slow down some of these steps to the point where they're good, they're going to make the next step easier. Then you do the next step, and you make sure you've done that well by taking just a little extra time. Then by the time you've done a few steps, all the steps flow much more quickly because each step leads to the success of the next one. Each step leads to the ease and the speed of doing the next one. By the time you know it, you've got it done. So that's what we're aiming for. Okay, so most of you discovered the truth that you have to discover on your own. You have to discover this truth on your own because I've learned that you cannot discover this truth by my telling you the truth. Okay? You can't get it by my telling you. You can only get it by discovering it for yourself. So experiment around as you're doing the preps, try things in different ways, and then see how they work. See what happens. For example, if you try to do a Class 2 prep looking down the axis, you use the mirror, you look down the axis. Yesterday we were working the upper arch, so it's easy to use a mirror. It's in your hand, you look down the axis, and you try to do the prep looking down the axis. And I showed all of you yesterday, almost all of you, that if you try that, it won't work. And so I said, okay, if you look this direction, you can see that you're leaning the burr into the adjacent tooth. If you try to look vertically down the axis, you can't see that you're leaning the burr into the adjacent tooth. When that truly registers, when you really take that in, when you integrate that knowledge, then you won't try looking down the axis again. Because inevitably, if you try to look down the axis, you will hit the adjacent tooth. You'll do a whole bunch of different things. And most of you discovered that yesterday. If I'm looking down the axis and doing this prep here, I'm going to tend to lean the burr away toward the distal so I can see the burr. That's what everybody does. They say, okay, if I'm looking down the axis, I can't see anything. I can't see the burr because the handpiece is in the way. I'll move the handpiece. Okay, now I can see the burr. And so, but in order to do that, you've got to be cutting the adjacent tooth like this. You're going to slope your gingival floor a lot. You're going to undercut the axial wall. You're going to slope the pulpal floor like this, and you're going to undercut the marginal ridge. a whole bunch of really huge mistakes. So sometimes that's the way it is. You do one thing wrong and you get a whole bunch of symptoms. Okay? We call that a syndrome, don't we, in medicine? Okay? This is proximal syndrome. All right? You try to look down the axis. Maybe I should call it looking down the axis syndrome. As soon as you look down the axis, all that happens. None of it's good. All of it's a big problem. So when you noticed yesterday that you're cutting off the adjacent tooth, you might not have noticed it while you were doing it. If you're looking this way, you can't see that you're hitting the adjacent tooth. But then when I showed you, if I look this way, I can see that you're leaning the burr into the adjacent tooth. So if you'd been looking this way, you would have seen that angle. You would have seen yourself hitting the adjacent tooth. But you looked this way, so you couldn't see it. If you look this way, you could see it. So let's look this way from now on. All right? Then, again, looking parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle, whenever you're near the adjacent tooth, you can see everything you need to. You can see where you are axially, how close you are to the adjacent tooth, check the facial lingual angulation. Then we're ready to go. But when you saw me do it, when you saw on the screen what I saw when I did it, when I worked with you, when I went gingerly farther for you and so forth, you saw what I saw. Okay? You saw that I could see exactly how close I was to the adjacent tooth. You saw that I knew that I wasn't hitting the adjacent tooth. On some of these type of knots, you have to work really, really close to the adjacent tooth. Okay? So some of you are afraid to hit the adjacent tooth. Well, everybody's afraid to hit the adjacent tooth, right? But you don't need to be afraid. If you know that you're not hitting it, you don't have to be afraid. But finding this facial margin out here. Okay? Sometimes people get afraid to go out facially far enough, so they just sort of leave the margin somewhere in the middle of the contact. Of course, if the margin's in the middle of the contact, the margin's actually touching the adjacent tooth, so the odds of hitting the adjacent tooth are even higher. So I would be far more afraid of leaving the margin in the contact area. But if we're moving the margin out facially, again, as we do it, we're looking along the contact area, downward at a 45-degree angle. And all I want to see when I'm moving the margin out facially by trial and error, as we discussed yesterday, all I want to see is how close my burr is to the adjacent tooth. And I want to have the burr really close to the adjacent tooth. Because in order for me to move this margin out facially, in order for me to get the burr anywhere near the margin, I have to have it very near the adjacent tooth, and then I can find that margin. Or I can get close enough to that margin so I can see that once I get rid of that little hook right there, then I'll have the clearance that I'm looking for. But when I'm nipping out facially or lingually on these preps, it's all a matter of looking so that you can see exactly how close the burr is to the adjacent tooth, with the intent of keeping the burr really close to the adjacent tooth. So you can get the burr really close to the facial lingual margins, and then you can put the margins out where they need to be. You don't have to be worried about hitting the adjacent tooth when you're moving the margins out facial and lingually, as long as you know how close you are to the adjacent tooth. As long as you're looking the right way, then we're good. Okay, so we got the sense of that yesterday, and today and tomorrow we will then take this in and make it part of ourselves. And as you do the homework, of course, you should be experimenting. Okay? If you do a homework prep and you hit the adjacent tooth, you should say, oh, I hit the adjacent tooth. I wonder why I did that. Okay? So notice that you hit the adjacent tooth. Name it. I hit the adjacent tooth. Then think for a moment. Say, hey, how did I do that? And then do something different. And then when you do that different thing, and you try it differently, look in a different direction, whatever, and then you notice that you don't hit the adjacent tooth anymore, feel how it feels in your body to do it differently and have that kind of success. And the more you feel that good feeling, then the more likely you are to immediately do it the right way in the future. Okay? A friend of mine has developed a model for human behavior based on noticing, naming, pausing, doing something different, and noticing, sensing your body afterwards. It's a very astute course that she's put together. And I'm just realizing just now that it applies just as well to what we do physically as opposed to how we behave, emotionally and socially. So take that in. It's a good model for any kind of behavior. When we behave as we're doing a prep, when we behave in a way that we assume that if we just keep doing it over and over and over the same way, that we'll get better. That's a bad assumption. And so as we take a little bit different approach and experiment around and try different things, things improve a lot. Okay, so any questions about what we did yesterday?
I have a question about the exit angles.
Sure.
So whenever I'm having a very hard time making the right exit angles. So I'm the same thing. I'm very scared to hit the adjacent tooth while making the exit angles. So
Okay, hold on a second. We've got two different things. So if you're afraid to hit the adjacent tooth, at that point is when you're trying to find the margin.
yes, sir.
Like I was just talking about, if you're moving the margin out facially or lingually, you don't have to be afraid to hit the adjacent tooth. If you're looking in the right direction, you know how close you are to the adjacent tooth. But that's a matter of finding the margins. The angles are a separate step. You don't have to be afraid of hitting the adjacent tooth when you cut the angle inward, because you're cutting away from the adjacent tooth. So how could you hit the adjacent tooth, right?
And Doc, how do we? So we make the exit angles, and then we make the angles, right? After that, the 90-degree angles.
Well, okay, when we find the margin, the next step is to cut inward.
Inwards. Okay.
And so cutting straight inward is pretty easy. Put the burr at the margin and go. And then we have to, of course, look to see what we got.
Okay.
Do we have a 90-degree angle? So sometimes the challenge of cutting a 90-degree angle isn't cutting the angle, it's knowing that you have it.
The margin.
Knowing that you have a 90-degree angle. So the first page in the workbook, which you guys did last night,
Yeah, I.
okay? So that's asking you to take a curve and put a point on that curve and draw a line perpendicular to that point, or perpendicular to the curve at that point. And of course you could draw a tangent and then draw a line perpendicular to the tangent at that point, whatever. So that's to give you a sense of what 90 degrees looks like. When you're looking down the axis of the tooth, the outline of the tooth is just basically a two-dimensional line. And the wall that you're cutting is basically looks like a line as well. When you're looking down a wall, it looks like a line. So you've got a curved outside surface, which is really a line, and then it's the same thing as you have on a two-dimensional surface here on a piece of paper. It looks the same way. So again, when you visualize the tangent to the surface or tangent to the curve at the point where the margin is, and then visualize a wall perpendicular to that tangent, that's your 90-degree angle. That's parallel to the enamel rods. Picture how the enamel rods run and picture yourself cutting parallel to them. But again, when you find the margin, you cut straight in and you check with the mirror, whether it's the upper arch or the lower arch, any place, you're going to cut away from the margin and then check in the mirror to see what angle you got. Okay. Now, if you've started out with the pulpal floor really shallow, like some of you did yesterday, it's a common thing to think, okay, I'm afraid of how this is going to work out, so I'm going to do it just a little bit. I'm just going to make it really shallow. Okay? The problem is when you go really shallow, you have really short walls around the periphery. Okay? The walls around the outline are very short. And then if you take your burr and you're along that wall and you slip a little bit and hit the wall, it cuts like right through it. Okay? If the wall were taller because you have the pulpal floor in a better position and you hit the wall, it's not going to do so much damage. If you slip a little bit and hit it accidentally, it's not going to cut so far. The thickness of the wall, the bulk that you're hitting is going to keep it from cutting too much. But a lot of you started out really shallow and then you're cutting way out over here, and of course you will, because there's nothing to keep you from doing that. So once you get the pulpal floor in the right place and get to the adjacent tooth and get to the facial lingual margins with tall enough walls, then when you're cutting inward, your burr is cutting more tooth structure, and you'll start out cutting straight in and it's going to be obtuse, and then you'll check it and you'll do it again. It's going to be a little bit less obtuse. You check it, cut it again, it's going to be closer to 90, and then check it, it's 90, then you're fine. So you can do it a little bit at a time and get that angle adjusted to 90 degrees, as long as you can see it. If your walls are really short, or you're cutting with the speed of the handpiece too high, when you cut inward, the burr might just go wherever it wants to go. And you might end up with an acute angle right from the get-go. You might start there and all of a sudden go whoop, and then you're in trouble. So when the wall is short and you're cutting too aggressively, and you're cutting too fast, and the burr's turning too fast, then it might take off and go in a strange direction. So calm the burr down a little bit, keep the speed down. Use a sharp burr so it's predictable, okay? But keep the speed down and keep the wall tall, so when you're cutting inward, the first time you cut, you're going to get an obtuse angle. Second time you cut, it's going to be an obtuse angle. This is what I was showing you yesterday. Third time you cut, it's going to get closer to 90. Fourth time, okay, we're getting pretty close to 90, but every time you cut in, you check it, you adjust it a little bit, you check it, you adjust a little bit, check it, got 90-degree angle. Then all you have to do is stop cutting and you're fine, go on to the next step. So then make sure it's long enough past where the axial is going to be, then make a smooth curve to joint basements. So everything we talked about yesterday. But in order to cut a good 90-degree angle, you have to set it up so that it's controllable while you're doing it and know how to recognize when you actually have a 90-degree angle. Okay?
I'm having a problem with gingival clearance in the facial area. It's kind of doable when I'm viewing it from the lingual side. It's easier to make the lingual gingival margin, but the facial side, I always hit the adjacent tooth.
Okay. You said you had trouble getting clearance, so the trouble you're having is that you're hitting the adjacent tooth as
Yes,
opposed to...
I don't know where to look when I'm doing the facial wall for the gingival clearance.
Parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle. Always the same. So that's one thing you can count on. So we're looking parallel to contact, downward at a 45-degree angle. Now, one of the two walls, facial or lingual, depending upon the quadrant you're in, or whether you're right or left-handed, one of those two walls, you can't see the wall. Okay? But you can still see how close you are to the adjacent tooth. Okay? Like I showed you yesterday, once you've got a little clearance, you can see through that space and you can see how close the burr is to the adjacent tooth, so you can start right there. So you know that you're not hitting the adjacent tooth, as long as you're looking parallel to contact, downward at a 45-degree angle. Okay? So what I thought you were going to say is you're having trouble getting gingival clearance on the facial side.
Yes.
No, that's a different subject.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay. So probably what's happening is that you're leaning the burr lingually. So does that make sense? Let me see. If I'm leaning the burr lingually when I'm working in the box, because I didn't check the vertical angle to make sure I had it vertical, but if I lean it lingually and I'm working in the box, I could be looking this way, but I'm leaning the burr away from myself and I can't see that lingual angulation because I didn't check it this way, correct it. So I'm leaning it lingually. So if I'm leaning it lingually, the gingival floor is going to be perpendicular to the burr. If the burr is leaning lingually, the gingival floor rises as it comes toward the facial. And it's harder to get clearance gingivally on the facial side. Okay? If you have the burr vertical and the gingival floor then be horizontal, then you'll have a more uniform gingival clearance all the way from facial to lingual. Okay? So watch the vertical angle. Okay? That's probably what's happening. Okay. Good question, though. And I end up pointing that out to a lot of different people a lot of times during the course as we come to situations that show that. But it's a good general awareness to have before we start doing preps. Again, the consequence of not checking from the side and not making sure the burr is vertical facial lingually, that's one of the consequences.
And the walls also, they start converging, diverging, sorry.
Well, it depends.
That's what was happening to me, because everything was fine, the box was okay, but when you looked at it properly, the box was not, it was for composite, not amalgam.
Okay, well, actually, for a composite, the only difference is really the exit angles are not 90 degrees like this. We could have a successful composite prep that diverges occlusally. Okay, and because of adhesion, it'll stay in place. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But if you're looking down the axis and you're seeing your facial lingual walls diverging occlusally for amalgam, you got a big problem. Now, did you figure out why that was happening?
Yes.
What did you figure out?
I wasn't using the right burr to trim out the box walls, and also my placement burr was not right. It was vertical. I wasn't looking the right way. That's what
Okay.
Dr. Mai was telling me yesterday.
Okay, and there's a little bit more to it than that. If you're using a 50 fiber, we're fine, so that's good. But if you are looking parallel to the contact downward at a 45-degree angle and you don't see that you're leading the burr facially on the facial side, that wall is going to diverge. Now, if you keep looking in the same direction the whole time and you do the lingual wall, it's going to be converging, okay? The whole prep's going to lean this way, and the genital floor is going to be like that. But if you haven't figured out yet, and none of you have, if you haven't figured out yet how to work against a wall that you cannot see, okay, you have to realize that when you're looking parallel to contact downward at a 45-degree angle, one wall you can see, the other wall you can't. As I said yesterday, you've already did the top half of the wall that you can't see, so you know that's right. All you have to do is just let the burr follow that. Let the top half of the wall guide you when you go gingerly, and you're okay. But if you decide, okay, I really want to see this other wall, so if I can see the facial wall looking parallel to contact downward at a 45-degree angle, I'll see the facial wall, and I'm not checking from the side, so I don't realize I'm leaning outward, and then I do the lingual wall by coming around to a different position so I can look directly at the lingual wall, and I still lean the burr away from me, because everybody tends to lean the burr away from themselves until they check and correct. But if you're looking at this wall and leaning it away from you, and looking at this wall and leaning it away from you, guess what? You have a diverging prep. Okay? If you look one direction and lean the burr away from you, you get one wall divergent, but the other wall is undercut, and it may still be convergent occlusally and still have the amalgam stay in. But it causes other problems when you lean one wall outward like this. It causes other problems too. So yeah, we're going to have to learn to look at the prep from one direction only and do both the facial and the walls of the box. So again, when you see me doing it as I come around to work on yours, there's always one wall I can't see. You look at the screen and you can't see it either. So I oftentimes get the reaction of students are looking at the screen, and when they're comfortable looking at the screen when they can see the wall with me. Let's say there's a facial wall, but then I start working on the lingual wall, and they can't see it on the screen, so they try to start looking in the mouth where I'm working, so they can see what I'm doing on the lingual wall. But you don't get to do that. Okay? You don't get to do that because you're only going to be in control when you're looking from one direction and only one direction. Check this way, but look this way, and then do the facial wall. Okay, you can see that, but do the lingual wall. And again, you have to feel what you already did on the occlusal and then see where you are. Again, you can see where you are axially, see how close you are to the adjacent tooth, even if you can't see the whole burr, right? So those are the things you have to kind of get a sense of as we go along. Try things in different ways. And I'm glad you discovered that you had a divergent prep. Okay, and that's probably the reason you probably tried to look a different direction, see the other wall, and then of course it's going to happen every time. Okay? So good try, and I'm glad you got that out of your system already. Because you know, the sooner you start learning how to just look from one direction and do the whole thing, life is going to get nice and easy. Okay? But there's this little fear kind of thing. Oh, I can't see the wall. Oh dear, I can't see the wall. Okay, you see plenty. You have to decide what it is you actually do need to see, and make sure you see that, and then you're in control. Mm-hmm.
So how do we decide when we put the ditch to place the gingival seat, to place our axial wall? Both the two preparations, I feel that the ditch that I placed, I already pushed the axial wall inside. So how do we decide on the correct position to put that?
So you are overextending axially.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because there's a couple different aspects to that. One is, when you're doing it, you have to see where the burr is, and get a sense of, okay, this would be way too deep axially. This is probably about right, and this is too close to the adjacent tooth, so this is about where I want it. And make a guess. You know, if I have the burr about 1 millimeter from the adjacent tooth when I go gingerly and cut away from those walls, I'm probably pretty close to where I want to be. And again, for each of you yesterday, I recut. When you went too deep axially, I recut the axial wall I recut gingivally and made that little slot position. But again, you know, I could see where I was axially, and I could see exactly where I wanted to put it. And then the goal was for you to then get rid of the excess between my slot and the outside surface, and leave the new margin, the new axial wall where it was, where I put it, and ignore yours. Okay. So the initial penetration, when you're making the holes and cutting away from those walls, you're just going to make a guess. But once you've done it, finished it, you know, how do we evaluate how much you actually did extend axially? You know, how do we quantify where you put the axial wall? And we talked about that in terms of the width of the gingival floor, but I didn't give you any numbers yesterday. So today I'm going to give you some numbers. So thank you very much for bringing that up. After you've done it, we need to figure out, okay, did you do it right?
Yeah.
Okay? So for a Columbia typodont, the width of the gingival floor typically would be about 1.2 for a premolar, and as we're going to see today, about 1.4 for a molar. Typically. For a Kilgore typodont, which is the case that I had over here yesterday, where there's a big gingival abrasion, we don't have to go so far gingivally. If we don't have to go so far gingivally, then the gingival floor is going to be a little bit wider. So the gingival floor width, typical, it's going to be about 1.4 for a premolar and 1.6 for a molar. Now let's think about that a little bit. The farther gingivally we go, the smaller the gingival floor gets. The width gets smaller as you go farther gingivally. And with the Kilgore, where the gingival abrasion is really large and we don't have to go very deep gingivally, then by the time we get gingival clearance, the gingival floor is going to be wider. We're going to be up in this area here. And you might think of it as being, okay, the enamel is thicker in that area, so we're going to have more gingival floor width to get into dentin to make the retinaculars and so forth. But also think about the fact that if I go farther gingivally, the gingival floor gets smaller. Typically, I want 1.2, but if I have an unusual situation, I have to go unusually deep gingivally in order to get gingival clearance, the gingival floor width is going to get a little bit smaller than that. Okay? So it might go down to 1.1 or 1.0, minimum 1.0, but that's going to happen sometimes if the contact area on the tooth is unusual and, you know, very deep. The contact area goes very deep, small gingival embrasure. If we have to go down really deep gingivally, unusually deep gingivally to get gingival clearance, we let the gingival floor width get smaller. Okay. So the gingival floor width is determined by two things. It's determined by the position of the axial wall, but also by how far we go gingivally. So we have to keep that in mind. So that's just a little extra complexity on top of everything that we talked about yesterday. But, you know, that'll give you a little bit of an idea. For accidental or Columbia, we're looking for a smaller gingival floor width because we typically have to go down a lot farther gingivally to get clearance on those typodonts. If we have to go, for whatever reason, unusually deep, if we're thinking, wow, this is really a deep one, then let that gingival floor get pretty small. Keep the axial wall in the same place, and as you go farther gingivally, the gingival floor gets kind of small. So if you had to go really deep gingivally to get gingival clearance, and you have a desire to have the gingival floor width of about 1.1 maybe, and you have 2.1, then you know you're greatly overextended axially. Okay, so looking at the gingival floor width is something that we need to do, you know, of critical importance to see where we are relative to where we should be. So if you get too deep axially, then we start looking at the pulp chamber, and that's not such a good thing. But looking parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle, and keeping the burr about 1 millimeter from the adjacent tooth when we initially make those slots and do those 7 steps and repeat those 7 steps down a little bit at a time. Just keep the axial wall at the same point all the time as we go down. And again, as long as you're looking in the right direction, you know where you are axially. If you're looking in some other direction, like down the axis, then the axial wall gets all kinds of crazy. And then, you know, undercutting it and overextending it and things like that. So again, all these things sort of tying together in order to help us get a prep that, looks like it's going to be right. Okay? Yeah, so getting control over that axial wall position, we'll work on that very specifically. Okay?
How can we measure these?
Oh, okay, what instrument are we going to use for measuring?
Yeah.
Okay, so for measuring, we use whatever we have. If we know how big something is, then we can use it for measuring, right? We compare it to something else. Now, we do have a ball burnisher in the kit that has a 1 millimeter diameter at one end and a 1.5 at the other. That's helpful. We'll use that a lot when we start doing crown preps or checking clearances with the opposing tooth and so forth. But you could use it for measuring the gingival floor. Your burr, the 55 burr is 0.8, so that could give you a little bit of an idea. Your hand instruments, some are 1.3, most of them are 1.3. So that would be good to compare at the same time. So it's always something that you can use to compare the sizes and come up with a conclusion as to what you've done in terms of measurement. Okay?
So the 55 is 0.8.
0.8. Yeah, the official name of the burr is 55-008. Okay? We okay on this side of the room?
I feel like my proximal box walls were divergent as well, because I just didn't know like where to see and how to keep my burr parallel. And then I was also hitting the adjacent too, but then once I was having a hard time deciding where to start nibbing to get the facial and the lingual walls.
The walls or the margins?
No, so how, in the box, when we start, bringing...
Okay, remember the occlusal outline is the top half of the box.
Yeah.
So the occlusal outline in the box area is the top half of the box. All right, so you got to find the margins, we got to find the angles, get the length, make the curves to join the isthmus, and then we do the bottom half of the box when we make the axial and go gingival. So don't think that the only time we're making the box is when we go gingival and create an axial wall. The top half is already done, we're just doing the bottom half. So we use the top half to guide us when we go gingival. Okay? But yeah, we do have to look in the right direction. And that is something that you'll learn. It'll become more and more familiar to you as you go along. It'll become automatic, and that's what you really want. You want to be able to, in the next couple of days, you want to get to the point where you say, wait a minute, I used to look this way and I couldn't see anything, and I would always get in this trouble. But if I look this way, okay, now I know I'm not going to get in trouble. And the more you do that, then it becomes sort of automatic. You position yourself, bang, there you go, totally into control.
Right. And then, when I went gingivally, I don't know if my clearance wasn't enough, but I didn't get an opportunity to actually create a bevel with the help of GMT.
Bevel where?
The gingival bevel.
There is no gingival bevel.
Oh, we don't.
No?
Okay.
But I'll clarify that. So when we go gingivally with the 55 burr, we get a horizontal floor, right? We talked about the fact that there's undermined enamel there. Okay? So then we angle the gingival floor. So it's perpendicular to the outside surface. That's an angle.
Oh, that's
It's
it.
not a bevel.
Okay.
Okay. A bevel is this. That's a bevel. Okay? So let me make it even more clear. An angled floor removes the undermined enamel. The angled floor is parallel to the enamel rods. A bevel cuts across the end of the enamel rods.
So how do I create that angle
The angle with a GMT.
with the GMT?
Just scrape on it. It's designed to scrape off undermined enamel.
Okay, so just scraping on the floor.
Yeah, scrape this way, scrape that way.
Okay.
Yeah. But you don't want to end up with something that's that steep. You don't want to end up with a bevel. Now tomorrow we're going to learn how to make a bevel. Because composite requires a gingival bevel for adhesion at that margin, that all-important margin. Tomorrow we'll talk about that. Today we're just angling.
Okay.
So there's angle, there's bevel. Totally different things, different purposes, different reasons. Okay. So yeah, I just want to make sure that we have the term correct. Now, a lot of what we're learning here as we communicate with each other. We're learning how to communicate, right? We're learning how to use terminology that is, regular dental terminology. It's the language of dentistry. So we're learning how to communicate that way and communicate precisely what it is that we're trying to say. So I will have times where I will make you repeat your question. I've done it already this morning. Because you'll ask a question and I won't be clear as to what it is you're actually asking. So I want you to rephrase that in a way that communicates to me. I might know exactly what you're asking, but nobody else does, okay? So I want you to rephrase it in a way that's really clear using the language in the simplest way. The good news about the language of dentistry is there aren't any verbs, there aren't any adjectives or adverbs, it's just all nouns. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, the more we really get the way to communicate together, we'll learn faster. And you'll also be going to dental school and your faculty are going to love you because you're really clear. Do you think I should blah, 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 blah? And they say, sure. And then they think a minute, they say, wait a minute. I knew exactly what they were asking. instead of trying to ask them more and more and more, what do you really mean? What are you trying to say? So yeah, that's a relief to the faculty members. So anyway, we're going to learn how to communicate clearly and precisely. So you're already making progress since yesterday, so that's good. All right? Okay, so today we're going to at least start just by doing an upper molar. So we'll see what the difference is between an upper molar and the premolars that we did on the upper arch. And so we'll talk about that, both the MO and the DO. We'll talk about why we do the prep the way that we do, what's the characteristics of the tooth that means that we can generally and oftentimes separate an MO from a DO. We don't necessarily have to connect them together, and why we don't necessarily have to connect them together, and so forth. The design of the preparation for the MO is just like we did yesterday, so that'll go pretty easily. But when it comes to the DO, it's a little bit different. But we'll talk about that. And so we'll be doing them together, I'll be demonstrating them, and so forth. That'll sort of wrap up all we need to learn about the upper arch. And then, but I'll talk about it, I'll demonstrate it. For the MO, I won't demonstrate. You'll go ahead and get started on that. This is the same as we did yesterday. I'll demonstrate the DO before you do that. And then once we've worked together on both the MO and the DO, then we'll talk some more about the lower arch. And I'll draw a picture of a lower molar over here and a lower premolar, and we'll talk about how to work in the lower arch. The basic anatomy of the teeth obviously is different, but the principles are really easy, so you can figure out what to do as far as the anatomy is concerned, the occlusal outline. Going gingerly is exactly like we're doing on the upper arch, but we can't use the mirror. Okay? We use the mirror to evaluate every step of what we did, because we have to be looking down the axis in the mirror to see what we just did and to help us when we're doing trial and error. But when it comes to cutting, we have to cut by direct vision. Notice I phrased it that way. You might want to phrase it saying, oh, I really love the lower arch because I don't have to use the mirror. I phrase it differently. The lower arch is more difficult because you don't have access to using the mirror. It won't help you as much as it did on the upper arch. Okay? In the upper arch, look, you can look in all kinds of different directions just by moving the mirror. On the lower arch, you have to be moving your body around and repositioning your chair to see what you need to see on the lower arch. There's much more movement, much more repositioning, and you never quite see it as well as you did on the upper arch with the mirror. Okay. So we'll learn that as we go. So we'll talk about the lower arch a little bit later, and then I'll demonstrate a lower molar prep, and then we'll work on a couple of preps together. We have a couple of homework preps this afternoon on the lower arch. Okay, so any questions about where we are, where we've been, and where we're going at this point?
We're not working on the premolar again.
We've finished on the premolar, at least for the next couple of days. So the homework prep that you should have either 5 or 12 DO on your typing out right now. That's what I'll look at a little bit later. But in the meanwhile, while you're working on the molars, I'll be looking at your premolar homework as well as helping you with the molars. Okay. All right, let's talk about the upper molar. Now, where's the decay? That's kind of the critical question right from the beginning, isn't it? We don't do a prep on a tooth because that's where we think the prep should be. We do the prep to remove the decay. Where's the decay? If we know where that is, then we know what to do. So we went through this process on the upper premolars, but you know, if we have decay in the distal, probably it's something like this. And there's probably some decay in the distal pit, probably coming along the distal lingual groove a little bit. There's probably some decay in the central pit along the central groove here, in the mesial pit. And if we have proximal decay here, it's probably something like this. Again, the size and location of the decay patterns have to do with the size and location of the contacts. All right, so why did I not draw any decay between the central pit and the distal pit?
Ridge, oblique ridge.
Because there's an oblique ridge?
And
And the decay says, uh-oh, there's an oblique ridge, I'm not going over there. The rule says, you know, my decay handbook here says don't cross the oblique ridge, okay? And again, when we're doing preps, we typically don't want to cross the oblique ridge. It's not because we don't want to, it's because generally we don't have to. So we have to figure out why we don't have to. Which means, why did I not draw decay over here? What is it about the oblique ridge that doesn't tend to get decay across the surface? The central groove is going to follow across from the central pit to the distal pit. But what is it about that groove that's different, that makes it so that that tends not to get decalcified like the central groove in this area? So let's talk about grooves, okay? There's two main things you need to know, and that this groove pattern right here is called a fissured groove. And then we have a coalesced groove. So the round bottom groove is easier to keep that area clean. On the oblique ridge, it may just be something that's much more shallow even than that. So we tend to not get things collected in there, bacteria collected in there that are going to cause decalcification and so forth. So that's why we tend not to have any decalcification across the oblique ridge, because we have a different shape groove. Now, we might do two preps and connect them together as an MOD. Why would we do that? Not because of decay crossing the occlusal surface from one pit to the other, but decay going down the pits and then undermining the oblique ridge. Okay, so that certainly can happen. So once we did an MO and a DO, and we looked at the wall over here on the DO and looked at the wall over here on the MO, and we see decay at the DEJ migrating underneath that oblique ridge, then they might very well join together, and then we have to do an MOD. If you're taking an exam and they tell you to do an upper molar MOD, well, obviously that's an artificial situation. They've told you to go through the oblique ridge, and you just assume that you had a reason to do that other than they told you that. So we'll talk about an MO and a DO, and then we'll talk about if you had to do an MOD, how you do that. It's really easy. Do an MO and a DO and then connect them together. So that's pretty simple. All right, let's just talk about the mesial side. Talk about the MO. So again, since we're assuming there's no decay, decalcification crossing the oblique ridge, we're going to terminate the prep about right here. Let's actually look at the oblique ridge. The oblique ridge is probably coming down something like this. And I want to put the distal wall of my prep beyond the pit, just like we did for the premolar. Beyond the pit, so we're, of course, including the decay. That makes sense, right? There's decay in the central pit. When we do the prep, it'd be nice if we actually remove the decay, which means we remove the pit, which means we've got to have the wall distal to the pit. Does that seem obvious? It does, right? But the reason I ask that is because some of you are going to do a prep and that looks like this. and I'm going to point out to you, nice dovetail, but it doesn't do anything. Okay? The central pit, still there. The decay, still there. So your prep was done more because you want to get a certain shape as opposed to actually accomplish something. So again, don't fall prey to that. If you look in a textbook and you say, here's the shape of a class 2 prep, and you want to put that shape everywhere you can, you're forgetting the reason we're doing it. The reason we're doing it is to actually solve the problems on the tooth. So in this case, of course, we have to remove the decay in the central pit. So we're going to put the distal wall a third of the distance beyond the pit toward the top of the oblique ridge. That's exactly like we did over here. 1/3 of the distance between the pit and the top of the marginal ridge. So that's a good place for it. We don't want to weaken the oblique ridge any more than we need to, but we want to get rid of the decay, so that's a pretty good compromise. We're going to extend into the facial groove a little bit, because probably there's some decay there, but also we're going to make the dovetail here wider facial lingually than the isthmus so that we have the mechanical retention, just like we talked about yesterday. And then what do we do from there? We cut right to the middle of the contact, remember? We cut right to the middle of the contact, bang. Then we nip out facially until we find the facial margin. We come in 90 degrees. We cut inward until we keep adjusting it until we get a 90-degree angle. Go far enough in so that we're beyond where we expect the axial wall to be. And then we make a curve to join the isthmus. Do the same thing on the lingual side. Find the margin, find the angle, get the length, make the curve. Then when we go gingerly, same thing we did yesterday. 7 steps. Drill a hole, cut away from this side. Drill a hole over here, cut away from this side. When they come together, it's the curvature of the axial wall matches the curvature of the tooth because of that geometry guy. And then, of course, when we go gingival, as many times as we need to get clearance, eventually we get gingival clearance right down here. Gingival floor width is going to be for a molar. It's going to be a little bit more. Angle of gingival floor, put in retentive grooves. Use a hand instrument to get rid of the hooks on the facial lingual margins, because they'll be there unless we overextend facially. So get rid of the hooks, sharpen the corners, put in retentive grooves, and we're ready to go. Okay, so that should be very familiar to you from yesterday. That's basically the same prep we did over here. But be very careful about where you put that distal wall. Be very careful that you've actually included the central pit. A lot of people lose track of that. Okay. Same thing over here. You might put a dovetail over here and the mesial pit's still there. So I have to show you. See that? That's the pit. Okay, so is that clear? Okay. Let's talk about the DO. So when we did the preps yesterday, and when we do the prep on the molar MO over here, we're going to start cutting about here, cut through the central groove, make a dovetail, come back to the central groove at the pulpal depth that we want, right to the middle of the contact, right? So we do the central groove, got the dovetail, got the gingival floor position, cut right to the middle of the contact. Well, so all those steps we cannot do on the DO because we don't have a central groove. We're not going to have a dovetail. We're not going to have an isthmus. So if you can't do the isthmus and do the dovetail and get the pulpal floor position and go right to the middle of the contact, if we can't do all those first few steps, then the first step that we have to do is we start in the middle of the contact. Okay? So over here we did the isthmus and dovetail, cut in the middle of the contact. Here we just start in the middle of the contact. There we go, drill a hole right there. So the first few steps, we don't do, just make a hole, bang. Make a hole right next to the adjacent tooth. See how close the burr is to the adjacent tooth is right at the adjacent tooth. It's in the center of the contact facial lingually. I drill a hole about the depth of the 330 burr, cutting into the 330 burr. And what do you think I should do now?
Extend facial lingual.
Extend facial lingually until when? Until when? How far do I go?
Until we get the margin until.
Till I get the margin with the deep clearance, right? Yep. When I know I'm going to have a margin with clearance, I'm going to cut out nipping just like we did before. Nip out about this far. So I know I'm going to have some clearance there once I get rid of that little hook. Same thing over here. So I've just basically made a slot along the contact area, exactly like we did before. It's just that before we had an isthmus coming into it. Now we just made the slot, but we've got our facial lingual margins. There they are. That's it. Don't leave it in the middle of the contact. If you don't have if you can't see that you're going to get good clearance facial lingually, then you haven't found the facial lingual margins. So of course, if you haven't found the facial lingual margins, it's a waste of time to try to cut a 90-degree exit angle because you're cutting it from someplace that doesn't exist. But we have nice margins here, so we cut inward at a 90-degree angle. We're going to change it, cut it straight, and keep adjusting it until it's 90 degrees. So I have something like this probably. And so now we have the margin and we have the angle, and I'm getting the length. I'm cutting in beyond where I want to put the axial. Do the same thing on the lingual. Keep adjusting it until we get a 90-degree angle and get the length that we want. So you might have something like this. So again, nip, 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 find the margin. Cut in, check the angle. Change the angle, check the angle. Change the angle, check the angle. When we have the angle that we want, make sure it's far enough in so it's beyond where we want to put the axial wall. And then we're going to do the rest of the outline form. Now the rest of the outline form, this is the interesting part. We're going to start here in the facial and cut all the way along the oblique ridge. I'm going to cut parallel to the oblique ridge. I'm still disappointed that this green pen is not any greener. I want something that's green. Man, that's not green. No, out of green. Okay, so let's use this one. So anyway, long straight cut parallel to the oblique ridge. So I'm trying to keep the distance between this wall and the oblique ridge uniform. I don't want to get too close to the oblique ridge. Obviously, I don't want to weaken the oblique ridge. I'm going to cut parallel to the oblique ridge, pretty much parallel to the distal angle groove. I'll extend until I get into that distal angle groove. I'll extend into the distal angle groove to get rid of the decay clinically, but typically, I'm going to move that groove a little bit. I'm going to make that groove a little more parallel to the oblique ridge. That's probably a little better typical position. So when I extend along this wall, I'm going to come all the way along here. I'm going to make sure I include the pit. I'm going to stay a uniform distance away from the oblique ridge. I'll extend into that groove to remove the decay, but in a type out, there's no decay, so we have to realize that where a groove crosses a margin, it makes the wall short. Okay? So you have a margin we have an occlusal outline, and when we have a groove crossing over the margin of the occlusal outline, the groove is lower and it makes the wall short in that area. If I were to make the prep like this, for example, where this groove crosses that margin as it's going toward that pit, where it crosses that margin, that wall is going to be really short there. So I want to extend the outline form into the groove to get 1.5 millimeters wall height. Remember, the shortest wall has to be 1.5 millimeters. So I extend until I get 1.5. So I extend into that groove. Now over here, this is where the low part of the marginal of the oblique ridge is. I want to make sure I get 1.5 millimeters in these areas too. So I should be able to get it. The shortest wall here about 1.5 millimeters, and over here 1.5 millimeters. So no wall shorter than 1.5 millimeters as usual. I'm going to preserve this triangular ridge a little bit as I'm coming back to that area. And so the basic outline form for the DO on an upper molar is going to be like this. Now, what I might ask you is, and what you should ask yourself, and for every prep that we do, if I realize I want to cut parallel to the oblique ridge and keep the distance between my margin and the oblique ridge uniform all the way along there, you have to ask yourself, well, how am I going to do that? How do I know I'm doing it right while I'm doing it? Okay, that's a very familiar question to you now, isn't it?
Direction.
Okay, I have to make sure I'm looking in the right direction. Okay? And what's the next question?
What's the right direction?
What's the right direction? Okay? You guys got this. Oh, what is the right direction? Now you have to tell me. It's important to know the questions to ask, but it's important to know the answers too. So we should be able to figure it out. You know, if you want to cut all the way along this wall and make sure you're keeping a uniform distance between there and the oblique ridge, what direction should I look so I can see that I'm doing it right while I'm doing it?
Along the direction of the oblique ridge.
Along the direction of the oblique ridge? Absolutely. So I'm going to be looking this way. So here's my eyeball. Or I could be looking this way equally well. If you're left-handed, you're going to look from one direction, and if you're right-handed, you look from another direction. It's different depending upon what quadrant you're in on the upper arch. But as long as you're looking along the oblique ridge, then as you're making that long cut, you can see exactly where you are relative to the oblique ridge all the time. If you're looking this way, you'd probably deviate and cut up into the oblique ridge like this, and that would not be good. So I know when I see your prep, I know exactly what direction you were looking. Okay? It's just right there. So it'll take a little practice, but as you practice it more, you'll figure out, okay, you know, if I'm going to look this way, and of course, the only way to do that's in the mirror in the upper arch, of course. But you can see exactly what you need to, and then just cut away from your eye, toward your eye. Remember what I said yesterday? If you want to cut a certain direction, look in that direction and cut away from your eye or toward your eye, and you're cutting in that direction. It's just that simple.
So the green line is invading the oblique ridge, right? It's within the oblique ridge.
The green line?
Yes.
The green line is avoiding the oblique ridge. It's staying a certain distance away from it. It's keeping the oblique ridge strong all the way through here. The orange line is where I actually deviated into the oblique ridge. This is where I cut all the way to the top of the oblique ridge, which is totally unnecessary.
So, but we are including the groove, right?
We're including the distal pit and the distal lingual groove until we get to 1.5 millimeters of wall height in that area. Okay.
And so for the 90-degree axial line that the blue line.
The internal line angle?
No, the blue line, the blue.
The exit
Yes,
angle?
that's one, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So we connect the green line to the blue line. We don't connect the blue line to the green line, right? While we are preparing our occlusal extension.
Yeah. Once we get the facial lingual walls done, and we've cut in far enough so we're beyond where we want to put the axial, then you look this way, and you start about here. It's the easiest way to start from the facial side and cut it all the way along there. Again, looking this way, cut all the way along here, into the groove a little bit, then come back and just preserve this area as you make a smooth connection to the lingual wall. So yeah, if you want to phrase it this way, the green line is coming out of the blue line here and coming into the blue line over here. But again, it'll become pretty obvious when I show you how to do it. Then what do? Well, we better go gingerly, huh? We don't have any gingival clearance yet. So how do we do that? 7 steps. Drill a hole, cut away from this side. Drill a hole over here, cut away from this side. And then when we go gingially, we need to get some clearance. So here's the gingival margin with some clearance gingially. Gingival floor width, same as we did on the other side because it's still a molar. Now, of course, we'll use the hand instruments to trim off the hooks, sharpen the internal line angles and so forth, angle the gingival floor. Do we need retentive grooves on this prep?
No.
So visualize amalgam in the prep and visualize pushing on the amalgam to try to get it to come out of the prep. and visualize if you think it will actually come out. What do you think?
The total hits that we already involved in, they will not let the amalgam go out.
Try it. Take some cardboard at home, even some, manila folders, something like that, file folders, and draw the outline, and then cut it out with a razor blade or a scalpel, and then put it back in and see if it'll slide out. And it probably will. It'll rotate out like this. Okay? So you can try it. It'll give you a sense of, mechanical retention. But that amalgam will fall out. There's nothing that's going to keep that in at all. Okay? Again, when you consider that it comes out by rotating, then it becomes a little more obvious. It doesn't come out just by moving directly distally. All right, so what should we do? We can't allow that to happen, can we? So how can we prevent it from happening? How can we prevent the amalgam from falling out? Huh?
Retentive grooves?
Retentive grooves. That'd be a good idea. Charles was really trying to answer that question. He was so tempted. All right, so we make retentive grooves just the way we did yesterday. And take a hand instrument, lean it away from the wall, cut the groove in here, lean it away from the wall over here, cut the groove in there. And then the amalgam can't slide out in any way. Of course, we get rid of the hooks with the hand instrument too, angle the gingival floor like we talked about, then we're all set. Okay? All right, I bet you can't wait until this gets fun. It'll happen soon. We're going to do 4 preps today in 4 quadrants, and then tomorrow we're going to do 4 preps in 4 quadrants. Tomorrow's preps will be slightly different. We'll have to talk about composite because we're going to be doing composite restorations. So the preps will be slightly different. But most of you have already been doing composite preps. Okay, so obviously we don't have to learn too many more skills tomorrow. In effect, when we do a composite prep, when we find our margins, and the margin's going to be the same place it is for amalgam, once we find the margins, we cut straight in. And for amalgam, when we cut straight in, we've got an obtuse angle to start with, hopefully. Then we adjust it until it's 90. With composite, we cut in, we get an obtuse angle, we're done. We'll talk tomorrow about why an obtuse angle is desirable for composite and so forth. So I have to talk about, adhesion with composite. And again, on the website, there is a chapter on the rise of adhesive dentistry. That would be a good chapter for you to check. So lots of things in all that extra time that you have at home. Lots of things on the website that you can be reading and looking at, so forth. Oh, that's right, I forgot. You don't have any extra time at home. But make sure you email me tonight,
That's right.
and I'll send you the Udemy course on evaluating class 2s. That would be very appropriate for right now.